Welcome back to the Horseman's Corner with this Van Hargis. This is from an interview that I did with Van a couple of years ago. One of the things and one of the people that he talked about was Jack Brainerd, who's into the Western dressage. And gosh, Jack Brainerd is an interesting horseman, isn't he? He's up probably in his 90s, Van, but really an interesting individual. Talk about Jack a little bit, will you?
One of my little dreams come true. I had an opportunity to do a clinic with Jack in Abilene, Texas, several years ago. Say a little bit about Mr. Brainerd and his attitude toward horsemanship. He was probably in his mid-80s at that time, and we had the arena divided in half, and I'm looking at one end of the arena. My students were down there, and Jack was looking toward the other arena, or toward the other direction in the arena, and his students were down on that side, and we were standing, literally standing side by side. One of my students made some sort of deal, and I yelled at him and some instruction, and I thought at first I must have said something wrong because I saw in the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Brainerd shaking his head. And I'm thinking, uh-oh, I must have said something wrong. Mr. Brainerd, what's on your mind? He said, Van, he said, I'm just afraid I'm going to die before I learn everything about these darn horses that I want to learn. And at that point, I was just so humbled to sit there and think, here's a guy that's 86 years old, I think he was at the time, who had probably trained more trainers than most of us have trained horses, and yet he was still on that journey of learning and horsemanship to the point where he was concerned about not getting a chance to learn everything he wanted to learn. And that's when I realized, at that point in time, I've got a long way to go. We all do. It's a never-ending journey. It's a journey that yields nothing but happiness and success if we stay on it and stay humble.
Yeah, and, I think he's kind of into this Western dressage at the present time, isn't he?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I couldn't think of a better representative for us as in the Western industry for dressage. Mr. Brainerd, I think, probably knows as much as anybody about the mechanics of a horse, how a horse moves mechanically and metaphysically, in that spiritual world, if you want to call it that, and how a horse thinks. But I'm just absolutely amazed at what Jack can get accomplished with horses, just from his understanding of how horses think and how horses truly work mechanically. And he works with those, and he does a great job in teaching others how to look for those types of things as well.
When we think of a gentleman that you mentioned, a Buster Welch, and of course his claim to fame is in the cutting horse world, fantastic cutting horse trainer, but a man like Buster Welch has to be just a pretty doggone good horseman to be the outstanding cutting horse trainer that he turned out to be, doesn't he?
You said it. I tell you, and I for one will say this: he was also extremely generous with his time. I'll never forget. We were in the Fort Worth Futurity one year, or down at the Fort Worth Futurity one year. And Mr. Welch. This was back in the day before a lot of the cutters had half a dozen lopers out there loping their horses for them. And Mr. Welch was back in the training pen, getting ready to go into the main arena and to compete. And he was warming up his own horse, and I was watching him ride this little filly, and he was getting his horse to take several steps backwards and roll over its hocks. And I was a whopping 9 or 10 years old, and I was watching him get this done. Everything just looked so smooth and so graceful. He wasn't, jabbing a horse with his spurs, and wasn't ripping the horse's face off with his hands. And so I just spoke up, and I said, Mr. Welch, could you show me a little bit slower about what you're doing so I can watch what you're doing right there? He did it a few more times, and he said, well, young man, why don't you just climb over here, and I'll put you on this mare, and I'll show you. And he literally let me climb over the fence, put me on this little old mare. And of course, he couldn't reach the stirrups, but he put me on this mare, and he showed me exactly what to do with my hands and exactly what to do with my feet. And I thought the world of him then for doing that. But years later, I thought, oh, my gosh, that was probably the most rich event there was going on in the country at that time in the Western horse industry. And he took some time out of his schedule right there, right before he goes in to compete, and shows a little 9 or 10-year-old kid how to become a better horseman. And I've never forgotten that. I don't think I'll ever forget that. I think that generosity of his time, and of course that sure inspired me to be the same way with my time and my knowledge. So yes, sir, I hold him in very high regard as being a phenomenal horseman, a phenomenal eye for good horses and for good horsemanship, but most importantly for being such a good character and sharing his time with others.
That would indicate to me, at least, that his ego wasn't out. If he took the time to mess around with a kid that was interested, doing it for the right reason, it wasn't because of his ego, was it?
That's for darn sure. Who knows? He might have treated an adult a little differently with a little bit different attitude. But as a child, I can't imagine being treated any nicer and any better. And like you said, looking back at it now, that was probably just the least egotistical move he could do at that point in time, considering his schedule was so valuable right at that moment.
You know what? If you're going to be a good horseman, you do kind of have to keep your ego in check, don't you?
Well, if you don't, the horse darn sure will. That's for sure. So, it's sure a good idea. Just look at yourself in the mirror and just be grateful for the day, and kind of keep that ego in check before the horse checks it for you.
I looked at some of your blogs, and I'm going to ask you about one of the blogs that you had there that was kind of fun for me to read. But what did you get out of judging a pony show?
Oh my goodness, it was. I've never really had ponies myself, but nonetheless, I had an absolute blast. It was down here in South Texas, and a group asked me if I would, volunteer a little bit of my time to judge a show for this little youth group, and their primary mounts were ponies, and it was just a blast for me. I had an absolute blast doing it, and of course, I didn't know any different. I just judged them like they were big horses, and the kids were just. I mean, I was just very flattered by how hard the parents had worked and how the trainers had worked to develop these kids, because these kids were extremely talented. And of course, Mr. Hale, this is cute as they could be. I mean, some of those darn ponies and some of the kids that were riding them were just, they were just a picture to see. And it was really good to see that work ethic, because, they couldn't have done that well at that particular show without having the work ethic that they did. So what I walked away from it was a sense of pride in the sense that I had an opportunity to go help those folks, but at the same time, it felt pretty darn refreshing to realize that this next generation coming up is going to be offering our industry quite so much.
Yeah, there are a lot of good kids out there, aren't there?
Yes, sir. There sure is. I mean, there's a lot of negative talk about our youth coming up, but at the same time, let's talk positive about all the ones that are doing great jobs and that have those great support mechanisms, such as these youth organizations and the hardworking parents out there that are making these opportunities available for these kids. So my hat's off to all those folks, and of course my hat's off to these kids for being so dedicated and working so hard at a day and time where there's so many other distractions.
Where you're putting on clinics and teaching folks, what do you get out of it? Do you learn something as well when you're at these clinics?
Well, exactly. I do almost every time I do a clinic. There's a tremendous amount I walk away with, and that's another reason I try to get my students to participate. Asking a lot of questions, work hard while they're in a clinic, because I am there to learn as well. And you never know who's going to say or do something that'll come across a little bit different, inspire you to word something a little bit differently. So I get that, but the most important thing I think I get for myself is that I feel really good at the end of the day knowing that most importantly I use my spiritual gift for the greater good. I feel very blessed in my life to have discovered my spiritual gift, if you want to call it that, which was using horses to communicate to people about what I call both horsemanship as well as humanship. And when I get an opportunity to do that, whether the crowd be as big as what the Rocky Mountain Horse Expo might be, or if it's just a small clinic that has 10 to 15 riders, it makes me feel really good at the end of the day to have that opportunity to share that with people and to exercise my spiritual gift. I can't think, Mr. Hale, of the last several years that I've done an event of any size that I didn't stop and say thank you to the audience for being there, for giving me that opportunity to exercise that spiritual gift, and at the same time encourage other folks who've yet to discover their spiritual gift to discover that and then work hard for the greater good to share that with people. To me, it's almost an obligation. Once you've discovered that spiritual gift, and once you've discovered your aptitude, I think it's a blessing, and I think we're obligated to use that blessing to help me. And so I'm eternally grateful every time I do one of those expos or every time I do a clinic. I'm so grateful for those opportunities.
Well, it is kind of interesting, the gifts that the good Lord gives to us, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And every shape, form, and fashion, every means you can possibly imagine, the gifts are there. It's just whether or not we choose to accept them.
You stay tuned. We're going to have more for you in a moment. You're listening to the Horseman's Corner.